So I think for me, working in the space with women entrepreneurs over the years, there's been a lot of coming and going in terms of different initiatives that really work towards supporting the woman entrepreneur. I think realistically in South African context now, there's a lot of focus and emphasis on the startup woman entrepreneur. And what I think that one can surmise is that I've seen a lot of women grow from being startup to being that woman who's growth oriented, to being that woman who's actually looking for the next frontier. So when Deb and I were having conversations about, opportunities on the continent, it became apparent that there was an opportunity to almost support and work with this missing middle, where there's missing work that is being done to support this woman entrepreneur. I think that also when we started this work in 2012, it was an amazing conversation that was looking at the barriers to doing business, particularly on the continent. And the focus for us at that point in time was the technology piece, appreciating that technology would be a great, connector of women entrepreneurs. As time has gone on and we've understood a lot more about, what exactly that's going to take, we've also come to appreciate the power of convening. And so our greatest and first efforts have really been over the last couple of years, which is when we've really started to look at making this concept real, has been not just about the power of convening, but about convening meaningfully, which is where Womanomics Africa really got born. It got born out of an appreciation of the need for women to convene, and through that convening make the kind of connections and engagements with each other. At the heart of it is not just the ability to identify opportunities, but I suppose also for women to transact on the back of those opportunities that have been identified. So what is exciting for me really, and I think for both Lebo and I when we sit and we look at it, is that on the back of that decision last year to host our first convening was the signing of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I mean, the timing could not have been better. There's all this talk about development and entrepreneurship, and what we saw was a political arrangement and agreement for Africa to collaborate collectively. And the first move was to actually looking at how to eradicate tariffs, or essentially working on the tariffs. Now we appreciate, and I always say that I'm a child of the 70s, and for me growing up in the 80s and 90s, what stands out for me particularly as an African woman was the Beijing Conference. I remember being in high school and hearing about the signing of this Beijing conference that was going to essentially facilitate me as a woman having greater access to so many different spaces and platforms. And I think I can concur that, coming into the workspace years later, the Beijing conference has really been, it's been really responsible for the opportunities that I had, the acceleration that I had in the world of work, and the doors that were originally closed that had been opened because there had been a lot of advocacy work, because there had been a lot of development work for women in those spaces. So for me, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is another watershed moment, particularly for African women. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement provides African women with a unique opportunity to leverage their space and to come into a space where they're no longer looking for permission to participate in spaces, but actually champion and drive a conversation. I think it's the first time we've ever had such an agreement on the continent, and I think for us, not that I think, I'm quite confident that women can actually chart and shape a new conversation. We call this conversation Womanomics Africa, which actually introduces a new narrative of economics that puts women at the heart of the conversation. So it's no longer looking at spaces, and we occupy many spaces, and I'm sure even watching this you can relate to, let's have a conversation and then let's add women. So women are almost like an appendage or an afterthought to conversations that actually impact us economically, socially, and in other spaces. We believe that Womanomics Africa puts women at the beginning of the conversation, not as an afterthought, but actually as drivers. If we look at the growth projection and trajectory of the African continent, we argue that if you were to put women at the heart of it and at the beginning of that conversation, we would really significantly see a change. And I think we're bold enough to say this because we know that the current economic data doesn't actually look or incorporate where women are participating. If you look at some of the economic indices or the indicators that are actually spoken of, they tend to ignore the spaces where women are currently participating. So the informal economy is one of those spaces, or just how certain sectors are spoken of in terms of women's participation. We often speak about the agriculture sector being one where, you'd hear that, it's going to grow by 2030 to an industry of $1 trillion. But if we were to ask anybody at this point in time, even today, how that translates into dollars in the hands of African women, you see a startlingly different conversation. We believe that there's a conversation to be had that actually focuses on the dollar value that actually ends up in the hands of African women. We believe that there's an opportunity with an eradication of geopolitical boundaries. Well, not necessarily eradication, but we believe that with looking at the African continent in a different way, where geopolitical boundaries are not the predominant way of interacting, we can create economic ways of engaging that look at economic highways. For us, economic highways are the way and movement of goods, services, engagements across the continent, and actually tracks and follows and monitors where and how women are transacting with each other, women identifying the opportunities. So if we look at where the infrastructure development is happening, where the agriculture and tech developments are happening, where the oil and gas opportunities are happening, where the money is flowing on this continent, we want to be in a position to not only identify them and not just say, look, that's where they are, but to ensure that along those highways we've got economic data that speaks to how women are engaging, participating, driving, and benefiting from that kind of spend. So it's not just a spend conversation, because we know that there's a socioeconomic impact of that interaction of women, and we believe that by putting women at the heart of it, we can grow our economies. So we started a journey that has invited women to engage with us. We started this journey just by convening as the starting point, and we're inviting people along this journey, and we're inviting people into a new conversation about economics, but we're saying that there's also a challenge there to change the narrative on economics and make it womanomics, women at the heart of Africa's growth.